Hello, can you hear me? We haven't started yet. I'm just checking things out. Hi, can people hear me? Great, thank you. Thank you. Hi, can everybody hear me? Hi, welcome to the Chapter 5 webinar. Great, thank you. I always like to make sure the technical aspects are working before I start. Great, thank you. Okay, yeah, this is the webinar, Statistics Solutions webinar on Chapter 5 for the discussion. It's typically Chapter 5. Some schools have different structures for their their dissertations, but it is the discussion chapter that follows the results. We do have a support person on with us who can answer some of your kind of non-content related questions as we go along. As far as content related questions, you're happy to post those. You can post those as I'm talking, but I won't get to them until the end. You will all receive a copy of the presentation, the slides and the audio component. And I think that's it. Let's get started. Okay, so first and foremost, if you've made it to this part, or you're getting there, you're close. So congratulations. I mean, you've passed. You've gotten through the proposal, which as you know at this point is a major ordeal. Have your results, or you're working on your results, and now the discussion of the results or the interpretation of the results. Which includes things like recommendations for the research and practical applications. So that's great. You're not out of the woods yet. There's still work to do. You can't take the victory lap yet. So, let's get started. What is typically in a discussion chapter? These are common features of the discussion, but I always recommend that you stick with your school's template. If your school has one, check with your school. You would know by now, obviously, if your school has a template. Follow their template. There are sometimes differences. They'll call headings. They may have different titles for headings, but they're essentially contain the same things, or they want them in different order. So follow those if there's any kind of particulars they want. But this is a general kind of the features that are typical of a discussion chapter. Okay, so the introduction to the chapter, it works like any other introduction. Restate the purpose of your study. It's just to kind of reorient the reader of, about your study. Restate the purpose. Remind the reader of why your study was necessary to conduct, why it was important. Remind them of the research problem. And if you want, you can preview contents of the chapter, what the chapter will contain. This section, interpretation of the findings. Sometimes this is just called discussion, the discussion section of the discussion chapter. But this is really the heart of the chapter. This is where you talk about your findings in relation to previous findings. And when they say interpretation, it's a little misleading. This is where you get to use your own voice and say the things that you want to say about. Not really. What they mean by interpretation is you can make some conclusions and you can give explanations for your result, but you need to do that after you discuss it in relation to the major findings of previous literature. The best way to kind of handle this section is to make subheaders or use subsections based on your RQs. If it's quantitative, if it's qualitative, base it on your themes. Usually you'll have themes. If it's mixed, you probably want to have a discussion section on the quant portion of it, and then the qual portion, because the qual is usually kind of explaining or giving more depth to the quantitative portion. So base it on your RQs or your themes. Lay out your RQ number one, defining for it, or the theme if it's qualitative. Just give us a summary of it. And then you want to bring in literature, previous findings about that area or that topic. And you want to talk about whether your findings support that research or they don't support it, they offer something different findings, or you're just situating your findings in relation to the previous findings, noting differences, similarities. If your findings also offer something new, you want to note that. And if there's something that you found that it's not really in previous literature, you just bring the stuff in the findings in it from previous literature as close to you as you can get them, and you relate them to your own. And so if your findings support previous literature, that means that you can make a conclusion based on that. Whatever it is that's being supported, you can conclude that. That means that previous research has found something and that your research has supported it. Therefore, you can conclude that whatever it is you're studying, whatever conclusion that is, you can make that conclusion. If your findings don't support previous literature, it's usually expected that you explain maybe why your findings were different. Sometimes it could have to do with limitations of your study, or it could have to do with like you had a different population. But usually an explanation should be offered for why your findings are different from previous research. As far as your theory, if you use the theory, you can, if it's appropriate, if it seems helpful to use your theory to bring it in to help explain your results, that's fine. I've seen people bring their theory in and use it well in this section. I've seen people bring their theory into chapter 5 and have it like a separate section for it. And there's a section later called implications where you can talk about the theory if you want to. So that's kind of study specific, and sometimes chairs will request that you bring in your theory and talk about it. In some chairs, it doesn't seem to matter, just as long as you relate your findings to previous literature. So your theory, your theoretical framework, if it makes sense to bring it in here and kind of intersperse it throughout your interpretations, that's fine. Okay, interpretations, limitations. And again, just real quick, back to that. Once you do that for your first research question or your first theme, the idea is that you repeat it for your second research question and your second theme, and so on until you cover all your RQs or your themes. And sectioning it out that way, it's reader friendly, but it's also writer friendly. It's easier for you to tackle kind of one topic or one area or one component at a time than to try to make sense of everything at one time, and things get confusing, and you end up getting yourself confused, and it becomes counterproductive. And next, you want to talk about the limitations. And these are, it's just like they sound, any weaknesses or any shortcomings in your study that may have affected the results. A good place to go back to is usually in chapter 1 or chapter 3 or somewhere earlier in the proposal. You talked about things that may be potential limitations for your study before you had conducted it. So go back to those limitations, see if any of those things actually pose problems for you. Typical limitations for quantitative studies include like low sample size, like you didn't get an adequate sample, so your statistical power and your statistical certainty are going to be low. Sometimes you couldn't get access to the population you wanted, so you have to use a proxy. So things like that can affect your results. For qualitative studies, let me go back. You also want to here discuss the generalizability of your results. In other words, how well will your findings transfer or generalize to the larger sample or larger population. And if you have you've met your sample size, say for a quantitative study, and your sample is fairly representative, chances are your findings will generalize well. If your sample size was low, that will affect your generalizability. If your qualitative study, your findings are not designed to generalize, it's a different kind of study. So you may need to mention that in this section. If it's a qualitative study, you probably had a low sample. You know, if you did interviews, you probably interviewed 8, 10, 12 people, maybe 15 tops. So your sample is low. And the idea is that you're talking with people and getting in-depth information from them, details about their experiences. And that's what qualitative studies are designed to do. So the findings for qualitative studies don't generalize well, but that's the trade-off. You get the in-depth and the rich information. It probably needs to be explained that way if you're doing a qualitative study, something like that. Implications for practice. This is just like it sounds. So based on what you found, what does this mean for people at the level of practice? You know, what does that mean for people in your area? You know, if you're doing an education study, what does it mean for teachers? You know, what does it mean for maybe administrators, even for students? So, you know, if you had to say, you know, if someone came up to you, a friend or a colleague, and said, "Hey, what did you find in your study? How can I use that?" You know, what would you tell them? And this is where you can kind of get really kind of nuts and bolts and specific. You know, does it mean, say you found that teacher professional development is crucial for, you know, improving grades or something, a real connection there. You know, you can recommend increased professional development for teachers, but through things like, you know, funding for professional development, you know, administrators finding, you know, additional funding for teachers' professional development. I know that sounds kind of like a dream. Seminars, you know, training, professional development training offered at the school, you know, mentorships. So you can get really kind of specific and nuts and bolts about practice issues. They just need to be based on what you found. And recommendations for future research. Again, just like it sounds, based on two things, based on your recommendations, based also on your limitations. What can you recommend for further research? So let's start with limitations. If let's go back to if you had a low sample, you did a quantitative study, your sample was low. First thing to do would be recommend for further research, future researchers to replicate the study, but to ensure that they had an adequate sample. So that's something a recommendation that could be based on limitations. Recommendations based on findings. If you found anything new or unexpected, that definitely warrants further exploration, further research. If you found, if your findings were at odds or didn't support previous research, that suggests inconclusiveness. So you can recommend more research on that area or that topic specifically, because there was a degree of inconclusiveness. You can also recommend different types of studies. If you found something really interesting, a really interesting connection between two constructs or two factors, two variables, you know, you could recommend qualitative research on it, more qualitative research on it to kind of understand the connection in a different way and more comprehensively than you can understand it just by, you know, through a quantitative study. You can recommend case studies, which are, you know, studies at a single site or a couple sites that involved multiple data sources to understand, you know, something more comprehensively. So, based on your findings, based on your limitations, but also different different approaches to the topic, so you can make recommendations for different types of studies. And a summary. This is not just a chapter summary. Remember, this is going to be the summary for the whole dissertation. So, recap the major points from the chapter, but also leave the reader with a take-home message. In other words, with the most important points from your study that you want them to remember. And again, check with your school's particular template if they have one. Sometimes some schools don't even require summaries. You can end at the recommendations for future research. And there is our information, contact information. We run these webinars weekly on different topics and different aspects of the research of the dissertation. So check in with us, check our calendar, see what we're offering, and see what works for you. And just kind of a final word, and I'll take questions here in a minute, about the chapter 5. People always want to rush the chapter 5, and I get it. You're at the end, you're tired of this thing, you want to be done. Also, you have deadlines. You don't want to pay for another semester. I get all of it. But you really don't want to rush the 5 in the sense that it's going to be counterproductive. And what I mean by that is, if you rush the 5 and just kind of, you don't think it through and you give something to your chair and they sit on it for 2 weeks, and then they turn it back around and say, this is really lean and anemic. I think you need to do this, this, and this. That's where it gets counterproductive, that you're creating more work and putting more time into it than it really should take, because you're going to have to go back and fix it. You're going to have to go back and readdress things. And that's not to say that you're going to get it right on the very first shot. I mean, that rarely happens. You always get comments and you always get feedback, but the idea is to get it as, get it as close as possible as you can, put the work into it. Don't give it a short shrift. Don't kind of, just toss it off as an afterthought. And the idea is to reduce comments, right? To do a better job on the front end, so it reduces the amount of time you have to, go back to it and edit and do things that you kind of didn't do at the beginning. Anyway, it's just a common experience that people they tend to rush the 5. And I'm just saying, kind of take your time and work with your chair, think about what it takes, what it needs. Also, webinars like this are helpful. There's also a lot of resources online. There's articles about, templates, guidelines, how to write discussion chapters. Look at all those. But also, and I'm sure you've probably done this, get a sample from your school or a sample from your chair or a couple, and look at the chapter when you're writing yours to see what other people have done. It just really helps to give you kind of a concrete example, rather than just, advice that when you sit down to write it may or may not be helpful to you. Okay, I'll take questions now. Let's see. How long should a typical discussion chapter be? Is there a particular threshold, or is it just determined by how many RQs, themes in your dissertation? Yeah, that's right. It's they're all different. But I mean, I can give you, they're typically not that long compared to other chapters. I mean, for, let's just say, a quantitative a quantitative study with a few, 2 or 3, 4 RQs, 12 pages, 10, 12 pages seems typical to me. For a qualitative chapter 5, which may be a little longer because you have themes, and you usually tend to have more themes and usually have more to say about them. For a qualitative chapter 5, 12 to 15 pages, 10 to 15 pages, maybe a little longer. But yeah, for a quant chapter 5, 10 pages about the sweet spot. I mean, it could be longer than that. There's something to say it can't be longer. Anything shorter, you're probably giving it too short of a shrift. But 10, 12 pages, yeah. Let's see, can you go back to the slide about inconclusiveness and speak a little more about that? Yes, I think that was in the interpretation of the findings. Inconclusiveness would be, again, if previous research shows one thing and your research shows another thing. So your research, your findings do not support previous research. That suggests inconclusiveness, right? Because researcher A says one thing, your findings say something else. That doesn't mean they're right and you're wrong, or you're right and they're wrong. It means that you have different findings for whatever reason. There's no conclusiveness there. So that's where you need to kind of offer maybe an explanation of why your findings may be different. And that may have to do with the particulars of your study. Again, there may be something in the literature that would help you to explain that, but you should offer an explanation. When we have conclusiveness is when previous research shows one thing and your findings come along and they support that research. Then we can make a conclusion, whatever the topic is or the area is, you can make a conclusion based on that because the research is agreeing. Does that help? Okay, let's see. Are there particularities for the discussion chapter when the study is phenomenological, hermeneutical phenomenology? Not really. I mean, just understand what hermeneutical phenomenology is, like, the approach and what it's designed to do when you're writing the interpretation. But you would still, I think, use your themes if your results came out as themes. Use your themes as organizing structure within the interpretation of the finding section. Discuss each one in relation to the literature and or relation to the theory. So yeah, I think things would still structurally be the same. I mean, if there were some kind of things you would have to address because of the specific approach of hermeneutical phenomenology, that would come out in that interpretation of the finding section. And I don't know exactly what that is for hermeneutical phenomenology. But I think structurally, just, yeah, you can stick to the same recipe. Okay, anything else? Yeah, just a couple of common, usually chapter 5s people do okay. And when they get in trouble, it seems like they don't know, they're not sure what to put in it. So coming to a webinar like this is a great first step. I mean, getting more information, looking at samples. You just don't want to go into the chapter 5 cold, because what people do is like, I don't know what goes into this chapter. And so they go to the results, they copy and paste a bunch of information from the results, and they throw it in their chapter 5. And not going to work for a couple of reasons. Number one, you shouldn't copy and paste things from previous parts of your study and throw them into another place. Professors will pick up on that and tell you to get rid of it immediately. The second thing is that chapter 5 isn't your results. It's the interpretation. It's the discussion of your results. So you just can't kind of restate them. And the chapter 5 is really a plain spoken chapter. It's relatively statistics free. You can bring in some statistics to help you make points if you want to, but it's not the place where you kind of, you pile up a bunch of statistics. That's for. So just a couple kind of pitfalls to avoid as you're moving forward with the chapter. Okay, let me see if there's a couple other questions here. The discussion chapter seems daunting at times because this is where you're stating your own findings and begin to question if it's right or wrong. Any thoughts on how to combat those feelings? I'm not sure when you say if it's right or wrong, because here's the thing about studies. There is no kind of right or wrong, and that's not to say that everything is equal, but I mean, if you followed your methodology, as well as you can, and you've done the steps as prescribed by IRB, and and just the research process in general, you should have some confidence in your findings. And that's what the limitations are for too. Oh, there's this thing that happened where that might have influenced my findings. So your findings are right or wrong. Here's what I found. Okay, well, how does that relate to what researcher A and researcher B found? So you're just kind of setting up a discussion. My findings support them, my findings don't support those. Then you make some comments based on that. Again, either your findings are conclusive, they help conclude, or they add something different, which you will explain. So there's a lot of it that's kind of, the pressure is off of you to make kind of your own interpretation, because a lot of it is really you relating your information to previous studies. So you're kind of not really on the hook. So that's why I would say if you're feeling like, oh my God, I'm not sure what to say, or if what I'm saying is right or wrong, I would kind of back off from that position and just look at it like, here's what I found. Your findings are what they are. I mean, you can't, you can't kind of wriggle out of your findings. And you relate those to previous literature, and then you make some conclusions or some explanations based on that. So it's not that your kind of ideas are on the hook, like I'm going to be judged whether this is the right thing to say or the wrong thing to say. I don't know if that helps you, or if that's kind of what you're getting at. But the best way to combat those feelings too is to just do it. Because your chair is not going to have anything to look at and not going to have any feedback to offer you until you give them something. So there's a way we can kind of paralyze ourselves, with kind of doubt and fear. And the best way to do that is to just start and get stuff on, and start at the easy place. Start at the introduction. The purpose of this study was, okay, there's your purpose. Remind the reader of the research problem. Okay, now you have a paragraph, preview the sections of the chapter 5. Great, you got an introduction. And then, so you get some momentum. And there's nothing that says you need to start with the interpretations first. If you want to go to another section because it's easier for you, that's fine. So I don't know if that helps you, but okay, let me see. We have another question. This is my first webinar. How can I view the other recordings? Okay. Our support person will answer that question for you. I'm sorry, this is my first webinar. How can I view the other recordings and this one at a later date? You will receive a copy of this one. Are we relating our results to previous studies used in our lit review or searching for additional studies? Lit review. Ideally, and sometimes your chairs will say, conduct a mini lit review, not just kind of a mini lit search to see if anything has come out since, while you were conducting your study, just to make sure. And usually nothing has. I mean, sometimes it happens that stuff comes out when you're, the year or two that you're writing your dissertation, it happens. And sometimes chairs will specifically ask you to do that. And ideally you should, just to make sure you've covered everything. But to answer the real meat of your question is, like, things should mostly come from your lit review. In other words, you don't really need to conduct a whole new lit search. Only for those reasons that I just mentioned earlier, if you just want to double check to see if anything has come out. But your things should be coming from your lit review. What is the difference between limitations and delimitation? Should they be put together in the same section or separated? Delimitations have no place in chapter 5. So that should be a relief. These terms, they seem related, but they're really not, because they both have the word limitations in them. And I don't even like the word delimitations. I mean, just substitute the word scope for delimitations. So scope is basically, I think it's in chapter 1. Here's what my study, it's like a frame, or if you're looking through like a periscope, like you remember, the old cartoons or the movies. That's your scope is everything that you can see. That's what your study will focus on. Everything outside of that scope or that circle, that boundary, is outside of your study. That's all that delimitation means. It just means scope. So it's a chapter 1 thing. It doesn't have any place in chapter 5. And of course, limitations, we know what limitations mean, which are shortcomings or weaknesses. So the terms are really not related, even though they seem to be, because of they both contain limitations in them. Okay, any other questions? Would the discussion in a paper be different? I'm sorry, I'm not understanding what you mean by discussion in a paper. I mean, like a research paper? I mean, a research paper, it's a whole different genre. I mean, a research paper is, you're not conducting a study for a research paper. It's you have a topic and you're looking at research on it. You're making an argument about something about the topic. You're not actually conducting a study. So they're whole different genres. So yeah, the discussion would be different in a research paper, because the discussion in a study, you were discussing your findings, and in a research paper, you don't have findings to discuss. Okay, again, there's resources, you have us, there's other resources out there. There are self-help guidelines, templates, but get an example. Preferably one referred, your chair, if your chair gives you one, ask your chair if they have one they want you to follow. It's just super helpful to see what somebody else has actually done with the words when you sit down to write. Okay, here's another question. If you have findings not closely related to the previous lit review, do you need to add new lit review to the discussion, or you need to add that info to chapter 2 before you can mention it in the discussion? Okay, a couple good questions here. The first one, if you have findings that are not closely related to the previous lit review, do you need to add new literature review to the discussion? No. So if, let's say, you conducted a study on a topic, people have done the topic before, but they haven't studied your specific population, let's say. That's what makes your study different and new. You're going to have literature on that, not yours specifically, but on other populations in the lit review. You're just going to have to bring in the literature that is as closely related to yours as possible, and say that, well, this is what, you know, Smith found in their research on this population. This is what I found in my research, same topic, but different population. So you can make distinctions, right? You just have to bring in the literature that is as closely related to yours as possible. And just say that, you know, we just say that, you know, whether it supports or it doesn't support, but that yours is new in the sense that it's coming from a different angle, or it's using a different population. And no, you don't. So it didn't need to answer the second part. Do you need to add that info to chapter 2 before you can mention it in chapter 5? No, you don't need to do that. So if you do have to bring in something new in chapter 5 because you want to, again, you don't have to. You don't need to, and then go back and put it in chapter 2 just so you can mention in chapter 5. You don't have to do that. If you do bring something new into 5, that's fine. You don't have to make sure it appears in 2. Okay, anything else? Well, if that's all, I'm going to let everybody go. Good luck. Again, we offered these on different topics. Check in with us. Let's see. Okay, yeah, I got it. And if you think you may need help or to sign on for help with us, you have our numbers, our contact information. You know, you can always talk to somebody for free to see if our services are right for you. And what we do is we basically work with you to get you through. We consult, we edit, we help you address your chair's feedback. So it's kind of a range of services. All right, thank you very much, everybody. Have a great day.